Thank you, Klaus. I'm starting to record the session right now. And okay, so for those of you that perhaps are new to this platform, you're welcome to or either raise your hand if you would like to ask questions, or else you can type your question in the chat box. Okay. So what is thematic analysis? I'm going to give you a short answer because the whole session is dedicated to this. So it is a method for identifying themes and patterns in qualitative data. The complexity of this, of the difference between each of these approaches, comes with a method that one follows to identify themes. And I put in here, if you look at the image in the right hand side, you'll see different patterns. You'll notice that in this case these are bricks have been laid in a particular form, and the whole composition reflects a particular style. We can think of our data as bricks, and the final product, which is how we present this data, as forming particular patterns. Now, to get to our pattern, we employ different techniques, and we lay our bricks in a specific form and direction, knowing that the final picture or the pattern will be rather specific and identifiable within a particular style. So if you see here, you have different styles. I can recognize some Victorian styles. I can recognize some Tudor styles of laying bricks, so and metro style. So my session, I promise, is not about this. I just became a bit familiar by doing my own patio during the weekend. So I learned quite a lot of different patterns and styles, and I thought this is a good sort of analogy, right, in terms of trying to identify how the procedure and the method that you follow to develop a recognizable method, in this case, a recognizable way of presenting your data. So we will be looking at 3 different methods today on thematic analysis. The first one is the framework analysis. Then we're going to move on to the thematic analysis, so-called coding frame, and finally thematic analysis done in terms of with a perspective on reflexivity. Now, I have to say that before we present on these 3 different approaches, that more recently it became somehow slightly contentious and debatable as to how to distinguish each of these methods. Perhaps Clark and Brown, is one of the authors of Thematic Reflexivity, have been more interested in highlighting the differences between these approaches, and often being not so successful in shedding light on the distinction and specificity between them. I think there is a bit of, if you like, academic posturing underneath, and I think in trying to distinguish them. And I think you as researchers need to go with an open eye through these thematic approaches and read at some point with a pinch of salt those areas of contention. I will be referring only a bit to this as I go along with the presentation. But the idea is not to coalesce these approaches into one form of thematic analysis, but to consider them as 3 approaches with some elements in common and few different techniques to lay your bricks, to continue with the analogy. I think that from your perspective, in particular, being a PhD student at a point of your viva, you don't want to wobble in front of a question by your external examiner, for example, as to why did you took this approach to thematic analysis and not the other. So hopefully this will help you in making those decisions and being more confident in your approach. Okay, so I'm starting this journey chronologically, right? Looking at the key, the order is chronological in terms of who appears in the scene first. And so that means that there is no preference of what is first or what is second or third. It's just paying attention to the context where these different approaches emerge in qualitative data analysis. So the first one is you have there a picture of the seminal paper, Qualitative Data Analysis for Applied Policy Research by Jane Ritchie and Liz Spencer. That emerged in the 1980s, mostly dedicated to large-scale social policy research. They were running an institute in social policy research, so they tried to to put a bit of, develop a system of analyzing large qualitative data. The areas where you see this being applied is mostly, I will say, is health research, social policy, but also it helps us. I mean, I wouldn't like to sort of assume that it's only in this specific area, but it can help you unpack questions such as contextual question, where you are identifying some form or the nature of particular phenomenon, for example, dimension of attitudes or perceptions held by your participants, the nature of people's experiences. In terms of diagnostic, it allows you to examine the reason for or the causes of certain phenomenon, for example, factors that can underline particular attitudes or perceptions, decisions or actions taken or not taken by participants. It could be help you, or you can use this approach with a evaluative purpose when you are looking at the effectiveness of some policies that you are trying, or programs in different areas. I mean, it could be not only in policy, it could be in health, it could be in education as well. What affects the successful delivery of programs or services? In addition, it can be used as strategic. I mean, in this sense, we're trying to, the approach is trying to identify new theories or plans or actions or strategies. So identifying actions are needed to make programs or services more effective, for example, or how can a particular system be improved. So there is I will say, a connection here in that last version with the intention of providing strategies and recommendations, and that is perhaps a bit more closely linked to this social policy or health research. It often, you will see framework analysis being conducted by multidisciplinary teams. If you think of, for example, health teams, where you can have statisticians or epidemiologists alongside qualitative researchers, and therefore it's also used or could be used with mixed method studies. That means having quantitative and qualitative at the same time. It doesn't mean that, I say the word often, it doesn't mean that you, a single researcher, cannot apply framework analysis to a particular set of qualitative data. I'm just giving you some of the trends. I have done framework analysis myself as a sole researcher. for example. But these are somehow the trends that you may find in the literature when you are reviewing some examples of this paper. It will start this process with an analytical or coding framework, hence the name, framework analysis, that will create that sort of structure for the data and will help subsequently to summarize or reduce that data in a way that becomes more manageable. In terms of the data to which is possible to apply this type of analysis, a framework analysis approach, is mainly semi-structured interviews, transcripts. You'll see in some cases used to analyze documents, meetings from, you know, a charity organization, or meetings from the minutes of the meetings in you know, in any school board, for example, etc. And also with field notes from observations. I mean, that is part of the data that could be included within or alongside your semi-structured interview transcripts. So we start with to give you some idea on how this work in terms of the different stages. The framework will start with, like all qualitative approaches, with a good familiarization with the data. And the familiarization with the data is not simply, you know, you conducted your interviews, you get a flavor of what's happening, of what your participants are telling you. This implies, when we say familiarization, implies not only the process of the transcript, which already gives you perhaps a closer idea with that data, but just to reread all those transcripts again, re-listen even in some passages if you are needing some, you know, further confirmation of what you're reading, or clarifying emphasis, for example, being presented within that particular passage. So implies that familiarization and starting taking notes as well. Start taking notes of what you are feeling from that data. Start to think around what people are actually mentioning, what they are discussing, what they are highlighting as relevant. So it's an important step, I shall say, for all thematic analysis. Being really familiar is a vital step for researchers to make sure that they get familiar with the data first and start taking some notes and impression of what the data is telling. And that leads us to the second stage, which is identifying what we call the thematic framework. So here, the idea is that some of the themes, and I use the word themes with a pinch of salt, I will say categories, some codes, yes, larger chunks of themes that start to be visible for you within the data. You start to take notes of those. And with those themes, after reviewing the whole set of data, I mean, you look at the data, you took some themes as relevant and form what is called the analytical framework. Now, I will say that this analytical framework is not your final themes. They are not your final themes. This will happen at the end of this process. But why we do that, starting to develop these broader topics and themes, is because the need of sifting through the data and making more manageable. So it's a structure that we use to then subsequently move to the next step that will allow for the identification of the data across the whole data set. I repeat, these are just to make the data a bit more manageable. It doesn't mean that every of the topics or the categories you identify at this stage will be your final analysis of the data. So you move to indexing, which is applying the analytical framework to the whole data set. There is an iterative process. You are still refining the categories, identifying new ones as you go along to the whole set of interviews. And then once that process is complete, you move into charting that data into a framework, what we call the matrix, that for that usually you can use an Excel sheet and present this data by using simply a thematic chart, for example, where you put one particular theme and all the respondent in the different columns. Or you can use a case chart where you put, for each participant, you put all the things, the big things that you have identified in the different columns. I mean, this is it's up to you how you organize that. The important thing is this visual approach to the data. This is why it's all contained into this Excel sheet. The idea is to be able finally to get into that step of mapping and interpretation, which is where the generation of themes in fact will occur. And I think it's important to emphasize on this. If the themes will re-emerge or reappear slightly different from what you have categorized before, because the purpose is different, the real interpretation of the data happen at this last stage. And this allows you to according to the author Richard and Spencer, it allows you to do different things, like for example defining concepts through your interpretation, mapping a range of nature of phenomena, different behavior, for example, creating typologies within the phenomenon you are analyzing. I will give you an example next. Finding associations within the data and providing explanations, because, well, obviously qualitative research is trying to to support, to provide explanations of a particular phenomenon that you are analyzing. Or you can also develop strategies. That is, if you are really working towards recommendation, strong emphasis on recommendation of how to proceed after your analysis of the data. It obviously will depend on your question. So there is a range of issues that you can draw from this mapping and interpretation process. I have an example here. This is something that we've been conducting recently with myself and a colleague, Stephen Hills, on trying to interpret intentional, unintentional, non-adherence to social distancing measures during COVID-19. So we use here the mixed method analysis. All the explanations matter, because we started with a quantitative approach. Starting with the quantitative approach with a survey, and then we move to the qualitative approach. Now, because this is an explanatory sequential method, that means that the findings of the quantitative method was informing, in a more explanatory approach, was informing what we were asking subsequently within the interviews. So it informed our interview guide. Now that I'm clarifying, just to let you know that of course, I'm coming here to analyze my interviews. I did 30 interviews. I'm coming already with somehow some themes to follow. Yes, it will become a bit more deductive in that way, because I am trying in the data to find out specific things to help explain, expand my quantitative findings. Now, those deductive approach, it wasn't exclusive only, because we also work with an inductive approach, you know, to be open to new issues that were emerging from the data as well, more bottom up. So we manage a balance. My categories here are informed by what I've just mentioned, what I was trying to find out with my framework, where I was trying to find out individual level, interpersonal level, and community level. If you want, that was my deductive point, the theory I was trying to bring into the data. But the themes that appears, and the reason why I'm showing it is also because you see the associations there. This is a typical example of typologies within this framework analysis, where you move from, in my case, was between two concepts, the unintentional and the intentional one. And there I can use a gradient between to explain those behaviors that I found associated within each of these levels. So this sort of more, the use of diagrams, the use of graphic, those associations between the data are very common and facilitated, I shall say, by the framework analysis. Now, also to clarify a point through this illustration, my things were never at the beginning in my coding framework. It came only after I could go through the mapping process. It did emerge really at the end, the themes that you see described in there. It didn't come at the beginning. So I'm going to check, because I think I have some questions. Claire, you have your hands up? Claire, would you like to put your mic on?
Yes, sorry. I just have a question. I actually can't read your slide, and I wondered, is it possible for you to send the PowerPoints out to those who've signed up for the session? It's just that it's such a small font on my screen, and if I make it bigger, it doesn't actually get much bigger.
Yes, Claire, we can. Claire, can I say, and for all the attendees, if you look at, there is an icon or a button there at the top left-hand side. It's a single icon there at the top that says Show View Controls. If you click on that, it's a zoom function, actually. You can zoom in and you will enlarge. I cannot do it for you, but you can do it with your own.
I've tried that, and the problem is the actual space doesn't get any bigger. So similarly, space only gets bigger when you do a one-to-one, and the space your PowerPoint takes up on my screen is about I don't know, a tenth. And then if I do a one-to-one, it's so big. It's so big that I literally have one word sort of.
Yes, we can send out the slides, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you. I haven't used this platform, so I must admit I'm quite surprised how difficult it is to actually see the PowerPoint slide in any sort of readable format.
Okay, no problem then. I think this is a question from Lara. Says, so the identification of things cannot be automated by use of any program, even with coding. They are manually identified. Yes, of course, you can use NVivo. You can use any. You definitely you can use software or Atlas D. I mean, you can use those software to work with the coding. But the coding process is only one step. It's not, they are not the real or the final things, and probably emphasizing on this because some of the criticism that you can read in other thematic analysis scholars is that this process start with a code and you set up the themes at the beginning, and it's not the case. You can actually develop your themes at the very final and see through the data and the association of the data and how you're going to present it, like I'm presenting it in here, only at the final point. I know that there is, I repeat, there is a tendency of thinking that thematic analysis, you develop your theme at the beginning, so like the other input analysis. And it's not really what Ritchie and Spencer are saying. If this is why I wanted to come back to the original text. Mind you, there might be some scholars that have used this in a more coding framework from which the themes appear at the very beginning. I don't know. There might be cases. There are many mistakes as well in the way that, or ways of presenting that are questionable, if you like. But I am returning here and on purpose to how, this is why I use the text from Ritchie and Spencer. I mean, they presented it initially in this presentation of framework analysis. The article that they published actually was a chapter. And I think I'm taking it from there to follow up on this and to use it myself. I don't know if I'm answering there the question to, I think it's Lara was asking. You can identify it manually, or you can identify it with your coding. You can do it, as I said, in software in an automatic way as well. And Marieshka, it says, can thematic analysis be used for strategic analysis of the literature? It depends on what it's exactly the analysis of the literature you're using, or the approach you're using, Marieshka. Perhaps it will not be this particular approach, the thematic approach. As I said, it would be more suitable for health research and social policy, could include education as well. It strikes me that okay, systematic, says Marieshka. So thank you. I meant systematic. Systematic analysis of the literature. You could, I think, you could use it and take it as the data obviously will be your articles. Most commonly is the final thematic analysis I will be referring to has been used for this type of approaches. But I don't see, in principle, if systematic review of the literature is better served by doing it by different people, as you probably know, and because it's a method on its own, yes, how to conduct a systematic review. And in that sense, yes, you can engage, like in this case, with other researchers and develop your plan of exclusion and inclusion of articles and so on. It could be, I would say it could be, especially if your topics and you're trying to develop topics around apply social policy or apply health research, it will be relevant. Can theories help us to identify our themes? Yes, of course. I mean, it's a deductive approach. I mentioned in this example we're in at the moment, I mentioned categories here. Those categories, I said, were deductively somehow introduced in my data or used to organize my data, to guide my interpretation. And that is because I'm following, for this particular piece of research, we're following the socio-ecological model. So I came with a framework in that sense. And following that, or following on that particular theoretical model, I am starting to organize the data in that particular way with these categories. Now, I insist the themes are much more inductively unearthed, if you like, inductively detected, inductively presented, yeah, as a method. I've been using more what was coming from the data directly. I didn't come with any pre or extra theoretical framework other than organizing my data into different levels, individual level, interpersonal, and community. So this was an example of typologies for this particular framework. It was easy for me to identify these two concepts. Of course, you can work with different concepts that you might be interested in understanding from or unraveling from your research question, right? It's all depends on what your research is about. You will always start with your question, isn't it? And from there move through what the data can help you, or the different frameworks and methods can help you interpret from that data. So the framework method can be adapted to use, as I mentioned earlier, with deductive, inductive, or combined types of qualitative data. I think, again, this is something important to emphasize. Sometimes you will see a criticism that this method, because it's very deductive, and it's not. I mean, there is absolute opportunity to work inductively as well, usually combine types of qualitative data. Both methods, yes, inductive and deductive at the same time. One thing that you sometimes see in this type of approaches, of the framework approach in particular, you see sometimes papers emphasizing on inter-rater reliability using the Kappa statistic, and I put there a quotation from a paper saying double coding in en vivo 11 was conducted by 3 authors, and then you have the name of the authors, well, the capital, I mean the acronym of the names, on 10% of interviews with final Kappa score of 80% across all themes for all researchers. That means that there was a higher agreement between all the team, all the 3 members of the team, yes, analyzing, coding independently on that same data. You see that frequently. Now, it's not always necessary for a framework analysis to reflect on that. It's not mandatory, if you like, to follow this method that you need to ascertain how, inter-rater reliability. There's no need to necessarily to do that. Coming to your PhD, obviously you won't be able to do it because you are working on your own. But if you are doing an inductive coding type approach, when you look for things that could be unexpected or things coming from that doesn't quite fit in your data, you could involve, and do not think that it's not possible. I think you can involve patient groups or public involvement representative of members of an education board, a voluntary organization, the people that you are working with, those that you are interviewing as well, because they can offer alternative viewpoints, and you can ensure that one particular perspective does not dominate in your interpretation of the data. So in other words, you might be able to reach out, not to all your informers, but at least one representative. It depends, again, in the context where you are collecting your data, and perhaps engage them in trying to see your code on how your themes are emerging from there, and have at least a bit of their viewpoint on how you are interpreting across the data. You can share with them some of these interview scripts and trying to engage in that conversation and see if you have somehow, that agreement. It doesn't matter that it has to be in a percentage, not in a Kappa score way, but you can, and it would be good if you could do that, just to bring perhaps a bit more of reliability on how you are conducting your data interpretation. Okay, so let's move on to the second one, which is called the coding frame or coding book, and it has an emphasis on reliability. Now, I have to say, this is called thematic analysis as well, and one of these seminal papers is by Helen Joffe. I hope I'm pronouncing her name properly. So it started perhaps from a tradition from Boyatzi. I mean, you have some references there. A tradition of content analysis. And here, the perspective, I suppose you're familiar with content analysis, whereby the qualitative data is heavily referred to, explained by a quantitative approach. So quantitative approach, as I say, is very merged into the qualitative analysis. It becomes a core component because they're interested in the frequencies and how many times a word, for example, has been used in a particular context, or how many times the meaning attributed to one particular word has been repeated by different informants. So, but the numbers is what matters. I mean, without that quantitative explanation, you are not conducting thorough content analysis. So this particular approach, the coding frame or using coding book or reliability, has stemmed from that tradition of content analysis. So they will say there is a difference, however, which is attention to tacit meanings. So they are alerting us that they are actually interested in those tacit meanings. However, there is a tendency in reporting the themes that will emerge from this analysis as being the most prevalent in the data. So here you are encouraged from this method or this approach to put a number of interviews in which they appeared. Yeah, you're encouraged to refer how prevalent, and to use, I will say, and that means that you are discarding those informants in your interviews that are saying things that doesn't quite fit with the prevalent, yes, or the dominant impression that you're getting from the data. So it's important to bear these things in mind, I think, when you are approaching a particular method. You need to question yourself whether that matters or not. It depends. We all will come back to your ontological, your epistemological, your research question, your design. In some cases, it doesn't matter. And what matters the most is to present the prevalent data. In other cases, it will matter not to miss any extras and to any few numbers of people saying something, and you say, well, I need to account for those narratives as well. It depends, as I said, on your perspective. The area where this has been quite popular is in psychology, a bit in health studies as well, in cultural studies, dealing with social representations. Again, this is coming from the time of content analysis, which they started with a lot of work in media studies. Then the topics, they can work on areas such as conceptualization or media representation. There's not, we will see some other examples as we go along. And in terms of the data that they can apply, you can apply this perspective, are interviews, focus groups, newspapers, diaries, and imagery and videos as well. Because, as you know, you are also dealing with this representation of ideas or social representations, but you are interested in prevalent information from that data. So it's not uncommon to see that. Sorry, I'm not sure if yes, well, this a paper is from 2011, and I think she's explaining, Helen Joffe here in this particular chapter, is clarifying or laying all the different aspects of conducting that particular approach, which will start as well. It has, like the other one, it has different stages. We'll start also with data familiarization, and this is perhaps the difference. It will move to develop that coding frame, which could be inductively data-driven or deductively informed, using particular theories. But the important thing is that, yes, here the emphasis is in the coding frame, starting very at the beginning of the process. And the second step is that of checking the reliability of this coding frame. And this type of information matters, and it has to be always explained in terms of the procedures taken, how the application of the code to the data. You will need here 2 independent coders, apply to a proportion of the data. Usually they recommend between 10 and 20% of your data needs to be independently coded, and you need to present the inter-rater reliability, that's how they agree in terms of coders. And if it is high, and this is because they're using the Kappa statistics, means above 75% of similarity, the coded frame is regarded as transparent and reliable. And if not, then there is a need then to recode the whole set to try to get to an agreement between the 2 coders. So there is an emphasis on this quantitative numerical approach in that many scholars have somehow criticized this approach for being too positivistic, yeah, as if the data is there and it has to be discovered by the researcher, as if there is, that existence of the data outside the subjectivity of the researcher, where other approaches are more interesting to say it doesn't matter if we agree or not agree. It doesn't matter if we are 2 or 3 of us looking at the same data. What matters is that we're being informed and submerged in the data and trying to identify, what the data more inductively is telling us about the phenomenon. So there is a bit of resistance in those views, I will say. It doesn't make this type of approaches less valid or valuable. It's important for you to know how to do it or how to present this, what sort of techniques or approaches you will have to take if you want to take this approach. And then another characteristics of these stages is that here, yes, you need the computer-assisted software. You cannot work manually, was the question that we had before. And and you can use, well, the traditional ones, in vivo, Atlas T, and you will conduct some comparisons between groups or patterns that you find within your codes, the links between the codes, the sequence and co-occurrence. Remember, you are interested in when they appear and how they appear and how they relate, because all that information, and thanks to the use of this data analysis package, the final stage is the examination of the themes through the connections or associations, but the prevalence is something, the frequency of those themes is something that needs to be reported. Yeah. So you might want to find out prevalence between, you could arrange these across sex, gender, or location, ethnicity, and so on. And you will have to present this in a way that shows some these numbers. Yes, for example, trust in government. Imagine that is something that you is one of your themes. You need to say number 28. So it means that 28 participants from your interview mention trust in government. So you don't escape somehow the prevalence of the themes. This is the way that this approach works. And I have here, again, this is an article from, a more recent article from Joffe and colleagues on stigma in science, the case of earthquake prediction. And they are using here, explaining in the thematic analysis, in the data interpretation, data analysis section in the paper, code reliability and frequency of themes. So I brought this just for you to give you a flavor on how this works. They say the coding frame was developed initially reading through the transcript to identify inductively recurring ideas that were entered into codes, to assess the reliability of the coding frame. 2 independent coders used to code 4 randomly chosen interviews. And then they edited for consistencies. An additional 4 interviews were then double coded. And then you have the Cohen's Kappa analysis, where they say the average intercoder reliability was 0.71, indicating substantial agreement. So you see here how they are reporting on that Kappa score and the attention given to that intercoder reliability. And in the second paragraph, they say, once all the interviews were coded, a frequency table was generated to establish the codes that were most prevalent in the data. That is, the proportion of interviews in which they appear. And usually they didn't show it here in this paper. Well, I can't remember, but I don't think I've seen it in this paper. But it's quite traditional. You will see in this type of approaches a table with all the code and how many times they appear next to it. Yeah. So just to inform you that how, it's that need of saying, of quantifying somehow this information and how relevant it is, trying to bring more, if you like, objectivity to the process. I mentioned before positivism, but it's also objectivity and reliability to the process. And these are some of the, criticism it has been subject to. And I know it make a bit of noise, it can make a bit of noise when we are talking about qualitative data. That doesn't mean you need to discard this approach. It means that you need to take it with its positive and its, its weaknesses, if you like, in order to justify what you are using it. Okay, so the last one is thematic analysis based on reflexivity. And this is a seminal paper from Virginia Brown and Victoria Clark. Perhaps you are familiar with this because They developed this in 2006, but after that it became like kind of I don't know how many citations I heard they had. It made a boom, I think, after they developed this approach. And okay, so they insist on what is different from this approach, or one of the issues that they insist on is the notion of reflexivity, which makes active choices. Yeah, the researcher making active choices and reflecting on the assumptions made on the data. So if you take this approach, you need to be reflexive in the way that you present the data. And we're going to see some examples later on this. The areas there has been more traditionally applied has been psychology and social research. Although more and more you will see this applied to other type of area, even including this research designs as well, like case studies and some ethnographic approaches as well. So here the topics could be participant experiences, practices, sense-making, behaviors, cultural roles and norms, representation as well. And it's a bit more large. I mean, this author, Brown and Clark, are offering much more, or insisting that their method can be extended to a much wider range of topics in qualitative data. And they use it, I mean, type of the data you can use this on is interviews and focus groups, newspapers, and the list is much, much larger, including videos as well. Minutes, I mean, this is probably the approach that has been encouraging, as I said, more qualitative researchers to take into the data interpretation. I suppose you're perhaps more familiar with this approach, where again you start with familiarizing yourself with data. Perhaps the emphasis, if you look at the different phases here or stages, you notice the emphasis that the themes will appear really as a long process, right? So first there is a generating initial codes, but those codes are really at an elementary stage, I will say. Because after the codes, it comes the process of searching for themes, and the themes, which are mainly the idea of grouping, you know, the codes from your data into larger themes. Reviewing the themes, you start to identify probably sub-themes and themes, just to make sure that they are making sense, or seeing if you can do that, or collapsing themes. Defining and naming themes as a next step. Again, it's an iterative process, and it will take much more attention to the development and the presentation of themes. So in other words, you don't know what happened with the themes until really you get to writing the report, which is the last stage here suggested. Sorry. Okay. So what you will notice in this approach is that more often than not is an inductive way of coding. You're working bottom up here. So you're leaving probably behind your theoretical or concepts that you would like to develop, but you're working more likely from what the data is telling you. Subjectivity is very important, and so much so that is integral to the process of the analysis itself. And I like this quotation here. They explain something created by the researcher at the intersection of the data, their theoretical and conceptual framework, disciplinary knowledge, and research skills and experience. It is not seen as something waiting in the data to be found. It's what I mentioned earlier, but the second approach is kind of trying to insist on the objectivity of the data, that therefore we need two coders to make sure that we are seeing the same thing as a reliable method. Here, that doesn't, it's not the approach that matters. The subjectivity of the researcher needs to be explored, needs to be presented, disclosed, explained, and the process is more like a creative process rather than a technical, form of agreeing in terms of what the codes and what the data is telling us. So, so you need to make that your skills, your background, your personal conceptual standpoints needs to be made explicit in your analysis of the data. And it can be used this with most theoretical frameworks. You need to make your theoretical approach explicit. It can be used within most theoretical frameworks. Of course, there will be some exceptions. You know, grounded theory, you probably are not going to be using this approach. So an example as well from Highfield et al. Is part of the group of Clark and Brown. This it's an interesting and very well written piece called Never Say Never, Heterosexual, Bisexual and Lesbian Women's Accounts of Being Child-Free. And here they are explaining, they say, in order to be, well, reflexive, we said before, is something that you need to make explicit in your writing. It is useful to consider your personal interest in the topic, your position based on personal experiences, professional background, or views on the topic. So you need to reflect on the assumptions that you bring as a researcher into reading that data from your informant. And here I highlighted how they present this. They said, on initial contact, participants were provided with an information sheet that included brief researcher biographies, so that's the professional backgrounds, and disclosure that 3 of us self-define as child-free by choice, and they say who there with their names, and that 1 of us is child-free through circumstance. So they're bringing an anticipation before the interview. They're telling already the participants the background, the professional, the interest and the perspective. They're saying, I am investigating this child-free, and I want you to know that we have a stand on this. And okay, so that was, I thought it was a nice illustration on how to become, to make this reflexive aspect of the researcher clear. Okay, so we are reaching 3 now. I think this is one of my latest slides. So the use of any of these thematic analysis approaches will depend on your research question. We start always there, your research question. And then your ontological stance, whether you are writing or your approach is a realist or a critical realist or a relativist or constructionist. Your epistemological approach too matters, and you will have to explain all those things in, you know, in your chapters next to your introduction. I mean, where you disclose your perspectives on your work. And then it will depend on your research design. I mean, I mentioned several here, but I said, grant the theory, probably you're not going to be using thematic analysis because it has its own ways of working through the data, and you need to follow the steps of the theory. You also need to consider other types of data analysis depending on your research question. Again, life history data might be better analyzed using a narrative type of analysis. Consultations or interactions between students and teachers or patients and healthcare practitioners, you may be better served using conversation analysis. And then it's documentary data or policy documents, news information that you might consider using, or more suitable to use, discourse analysis. So I think it's also important to explain why you're using, we said this from the beginning, why you're using a particular approach. You have 3 approaches here, but you need to make sure that you explain your position, why you're taking a particular approach, and why you are discarding others that might be very close to your type of data and your research question. It's always worth looking at, why you're making those decisions, making them explicit. Because like we said at the beginning, you don't want an external to come and say, but why didn't you do this or that, if you haven't explained it very clearly. So it's better to be as prepared as you can in that sense and clarify your position and your decisions of taking a particular approach. And to do that, you need obviously to become familiar with the approaches. So for the 3 approaches we talked today, you have the classic test that I've been referring to as a starting point. So you have organized these resources between 1, 2, and 3 just to remind you, the 3 order, the order of the 3 thematic analysis I've been following. And next to it, or below, for example, framework analysis, you have 2 interesting papers to look at. In particular, Parkinson has a framework analysis, a worked example of a study exploring young people's experiences of depression. So I found that very, very interesting because they are describing the process that they took in order to do the research, how it worked for the researcher, how they made mistakes, how they came back, how they reinterpret data. It's really a working example on that framework analysis method. And then Joffe put thematic analysis, the seminal paper, and then other type of a good example. I mentioned the stigma in science. And Virginia Brown and Victoria Clark, apart from the seminal paper, you have a more recent version of the different stages, but also offering interesting example on how to develop those stages and for their reflexivity approach to thematic analysis. And I put here a preprint because I don't think, I'm not sure at London Met we have access. Last time I checked, we didn't, but there is a preprint link there that at least you can download. It's available, obviously, online. It's from the repository of the universities where they belong to. And then the last example I showed on get thematic analysis, the article, that is also available online. Okay, so right, I think we thank you, Sarah. So I think I can go through the chat, or you can raise your hand if you would like to ask some question, and trying to look at the chat now. So maybe Debbie says, you say that in the reflexivity approach, you wouldn't use with grounded theory. From the description given, there seems a lot of overlap with constructivist grounded theory. Can you explain more? Yes, there is a lot of, as you say, overlap, Debbie, in terms of constructivist approach and the reflexivity and subjectivity of the researcher being engaged. The difference is that in grounded theory, you are trying to develop that theory, isn't it? And the process of coming back to the data is informing the process of data collection. Because when you are at a certain point in the interview, what you're doing is reviewing your framework and developing your theoretical perspective on the topic, and then coming back to other interviews and applying and trying to see whether it works. So it is really embedded in that sense in grounded theory. So I wouldn't, in that sense, I wouldn't use this to inform that qualitative data because of that. I would put that as an exception, and I think Brown and Clark, they wouldn't recommend it using in that way because of the inner sort of processes that inform grounded theory. Debbie, I don't know if I am explaining that for you. Question is, Lara, I continue with some question. Is coding frame the same as grounded theory? No, Lara. I think that grounded theory is a completely different approach, and the coding frame is, I suppose you're referring to the second one that I presented, and I will say it's actually very distant from grounded theory, because they are interested in that reliability on the process and trying to quantify the data in a way that it will be that odds, I think, with the process that you see in forming grounded theory. I will leave, just to make it perhaps clearer, I will leave grounded theory outside of these interpretative frameworks, if that helps. Sarah, thank you, Sarah. Mariana, useful, thank you very much. I'm trying to read any question. I have to go now. Okay, to another meeting, thanks so much. Comprehensive review. Okay. Okay, so that's Mike Bennett, okay. And yes, I'm trying to copy the address of Babette. I'm trying to apologize for a second if you're there with me and trying to copy an address to email. Okay, Jan, thank you. It's just very interesting sessions. Thanks. Is reflexive thematic analysis constructivist approach? You can be a constructivist. Yes, that's the answer. You can be constructivist and applying. The author might say or might argue that they are critical realist, for example, in their perspective. They will say that you can come with all those perspectives in terms of your sort of not only the reason, your philosophical position. You can be a constructivist, you can be a critical realist, a critical thinker, and you can develop from there. I wouldn't say that the other way around applies. It's not only for a constructivist, but you can be a constructivist and apply thematic analysis. Oh, thank you from South Africa. Brilliant. Okay, so I had some. I'm trying to copy all your email addresses to send you the sessions of those of you who are asking. Someone from Mariana from Liverpool. Thank you, everyone. And Debbie, okay. Debbie, I'm copying yours too. Pauline, I'm not sure if you are at London Med. If you are, you get this on Weblearn. If you're not, you may want to send your email and I can send you slides if that helps. Oh, you are Pauline. Pauline, you will receive this. If you're a PhD student, you will receive and see everything on Weblearn, Pauline. But I'm taking note of your email anyway. And Rasha from Manchester. Oh, that's fantastic. So many, I mean, I take it that many of you are PhD students. It's brilliant to see you here. And Jan from Sheffield. And I apologize if some of you evidently are not PhD students. I'm just obviously, I don't know, but I am. Please could you email? Okay. Brilliant. I'm trying to, I'm here if you have any question. I'm trying to go through all the chat. Karin says, in the past, we have received a link to the recordings, so I mean, not need to do it individually to us. I'm external in case. I'm not sure that we can send it externally, but I can try to find that out with my colleagues. I think it was Karin. And also I have, okay. Appreciate send you an Gmail. Aria, please come and reflect. Oh, I can stop. Oh, sorry.